Mondestrunken is one of 21 pieces which comprise Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire. It is a melodrama which he composed in 1913, a song cycle of 21 short pieces based on 21 contrasting and eclectic poems featuring Pierrot as the main character. This is the first of those 21 pieces and roughly means moondrunk. The ensemble instrumentation for the whole work features a small but contrasting collection of instruments from a range of families. Each of the 21 pieces of Pierrot Lunaire uses a slightly different combination of these instruments to give each piece a unique sound. This particular piece is based on the text shown, and it is recited by the soprano voice throughout. The piece doesn't always follow a strictly programmatic nature, but we do see some mood setting, some word painting, and melodramatic singing to capture the spirit of the words. The poem could also be interpreted as describing the effect of the moonlight on delivering inspiration, and introduces the example of a poet who becomes entranced by its effect. When conveying the text, Schoenberg uses all of the concepts of music combined, but we are going to focus on just 3 concepts as they are the most noteworthy: pitch, texture, and dynamics and expressive techniques. Let's now take a look at the opening of the piece, focusing on dynamics and expressive techniques. Schoenberg is trying to evoke an eerie and calm setting, and he does this in a few ways. Firstly, we have a very soft dynamic range marked pianissimo in all instruments except the vocalist, who is marked piano. We also have a legato slurred indication to indicate a flowing soft articulation. Adding to this, we also have an interesting tone color from the violin marked pizzicato and also mit Dämpfer, which means with a mute. So quite a soft sound to complement the other instruments. Taking a look at the vocals, Schoenberg has indicated through an X on the notehead that the singer is to sing these notes with a technique called Sprechstimme, which is to sing half spoken, half sung. So the vocalist doesn't stick to the given pitch, but rather moves and slides in and out of these notes in a melodramatic style, adding to the effectiveness of the vocal setting. Schoenberg also uses pitch to convey calm through register. The higher register of the descending semiquavers in the piano creates an almost twinkling effect. Added to this is the medium safe registers of the flute, violin, and the voice. Throughout this piece we will see a very wide melodic pitch range in all instruments, where Schoenberg uses the higher, more intense registers of the instruments for moments of increased drama, and the lower for moments of calm, like we see here in the vocalist. As mentioned earlier, Schoenberg often relies on motivic development as a way to provide unison through pitch, developing his ideas constantly. Here is what I have labelled the moonlight motive. It's worth noting that Schoenberg loved the number 7, and another noteworthy connection is the 7 pieces in each of the 3 parts of the song cycle. Here we have a 7-note motive in its original form, before any transformations. Now this has a particular atonal flavour to it. Schoenberg is trying to avoid anything that will hint to a traditional harmony. Some features of the motive are this descending augmented triad and an ascending tritone. This paints a strong sense of dissonance and suggests an atonal tonality. Now, it's best practice when you develop your motive to first establish it so the listener can recognize it after it goes through many transformations. So Schoenberg starts with one of the only forms of repetition you'll see in this piece, setting the mood at the start of the piece. At bar 29, Schoenberg places 2 developments of the motive against each other in a polyphonic fashion. The flute line first states the motive an octave down from the original and then proceeds to sequence the motive twice, up a semitone, and then again up another semitone. Underneath this, you have the violin playing the motive transposed to start on an E instead of a G sharp, and with the rhythms augmented now into quavers. You can find countless allusions to this motive in many different forms. Featured here is the flute in bar 11 through to 16. Let's have a listen. We first hear the original motive changed by only one note, starting on an F sharp rather than a G sharp. The phrase is then extended by the addition of this sequence of notes, which follows the melodic contour of the second half of the motive. We then take the second half again and vary it rhythmically, here and then with this elaboration through the use of semiquaver sextuplet runs leading up to the final statement of the motive. This time it is extended by the addition of two Fs. Now, similar to this elaboration of the flute line is the use of keeping the basic shape of interval movements and contour, specifically of the last four notes of the motive. So the flute here states the original motive first, then the piano takes the last four notes and, keeping the shape of this descending then ascending interval shape, then develops through a sequence and more elaboration of this contour at the end. This is yet another example of multiple manifestations of this motive all thrown together to create a polyphonic texture. Here we have the flute line again sequencing the main motive 3 times. What is interesting about this sequence is that it is based on the first 3 notes of the motive, that augmented chord, by having each sequence start on each of the first 3 notes of the original. Schoenberg then proceeds to fragment the first 3 notes of the motive and sequence just this fragment. Also note the starting note of each of these is also an augmented triad. A similar thing is happening in the piano part. The motive starts in the very high register of the piano, an octave higher than the original, together with the flute part, who plays the same thing but 1 beat later, creates canonic imitation. Remember, a canon is where we have a similar musical idea to starting after the original, midway through the melody. The piano motive is then sequenced down the same way as the flute, each iteration starting on a different note of that augmented chord. But here, instead of fragmenting the first part of the motive like in the flute line, and sequencing that fragment, Schoenberg fragments the second half of the motive and sequences it down 3 times. Now, we're going to leave our examination of motivic development here, but you can find countless manifestations and manipulations of this motive all the way through this piece, and it is one of the hallmarks of the Pierrot Lunaire song cycle in general. Looking now at Schoenberg's use of texture, we come back to the beginning of the piece, which we have already unpacked with regards to pitch and dynamics and expressive techniques. Here we also see a glimpse of the textual writing that will define the feel of this piece throughout. Already in the first 4 bars, we see 4 independent melodic lines. All instruments in this piece, and in most of the other pieces in Pierrot Lunaire, play a melodic role, which often results in these very complex sparse textures. The vocals here stand out in the foreground due to the relative directness of its tone color, and a slightly louder marked dynamic. Both the violin and the piano are playing somewhat of an accompaniment role with the use of these ostinato patterns. So we could say this is one of the few times where the texture is almost homophonic. We see another example of this independent textual writing at bar 20. Here, all the layers of sound are very independent to each other, and each line has its own purpose and direction. Schoenberg often exaggerates the difference by layering contrasting rhythms in the texture, like these violin triplets against flute quavers, violin triplets against piano semiquavers, or these 4 contrasting rhythms in bar 22. Once again, the vocal line maintains its independence of anything else happening in the texture. We also see some moments where the instruments shine through the texture in between the phrases of the vocals. This is still in the beginning of the piece, where the dynamic for the most part has been pianissimo or piano. Then suddenly we get this flourish of forte and fortissimo for 1 beat, and then suddenly back down to pianissimo. This preempts the word painting of spring flute in the next bar by the voice, and this happens between the vocalist phrases as a splash of color for interest. Once again, we have the use of polyrhythmic textures with this dotted quaver 2 demi-semiquavers against quaver triplets against a semiquaver septuplet. Here is another moment where Schoenberg creates textural space. drastically reducing the density so we can hear this exchange of melodic ideas between the flute and the violin, coming all the way down to the thinnest monophonic moment of the work. By the time we get to bar 29, we have the thickest texture so far, and this coincides with the third stanza of the poem, which introduces the idea of the poet or dicta as a subject. Until now, we had been setting the mood of this quiet, distant land and creating atmosphere around the moon as a metaphor. And so in this stanza, he's increasing the amount of drama and emotion as we now have a human subject. So even in this small ensemble, there are a few things that Schoenberg does to convey this sense of drama and to increase the overall sound. Firstly, the piano part is using multiple layers and extending into the lower register, which really hasn't been used until now. He is also more consistently using chords in contrast to single melodies in this section. We have this bottom layer of the piano, which is acting as a pedal point using chordal harmony of C, F, and B. This creates dissonance against the right hand part with a mixture of chordal qualities of major 7, minor 7 augmented chords with really no sense of key. Added to this, we have the addition of the cello for the first time in this piece, playing a lyrical melody marked molto espressivo with swelling dynamics throughout the line. We also see one of the rare moments of doubling here, with the inner voice of the piano left hand doubling the cello melody. This point also marks the highest point in the vocalist range, heading up to the upper register of the F sharp. In the next 6 bars that follow, Schoenberg continues to keep the drama heightened. We see the violin climb to the extremely high part of its register, and this part is still marked forte, increasing that sound further with the use of arco, a much fuller sound than the pizzicato used before. Accents are also added across the parts, and the overall dynamic level increases further throughout the line. The piano layer continues to double the cello, but is thickened to full chords in the piano left hand. This climax ends in an abrupt way with the molto writ over 2 bars, suddenly dropping to pianissimo in the next bar. So this subito pianissimo dynamic shift coincides with a marked difference in expressive techniques and tone color overall. This marks the ending of the poem back to the imagery of the moon. The piano has stopped doubling the cello and is adding these tremolo effects and a rolled chord, while the left hand states the moonlight motif with some elaboration. The expression is changed to molto legato. While the violin continues in the extremely high register, it gradually descends with a glissando effect towards the end. Matched in this is the flute line with a rapidly descending run. Looking back at all these features, the main takeaway is Schoenberg's development of motivic material and his use of overlapping melodic lines. Even with a small ensemble, Schoenberg uses the complete range of all the instruments to enhance that tension and the dramatic effect required to capture the melodrama of the poem. The individual note choices also favour dissonant intervals and clashing chordal harmonies. It's important to note that even though Schoenberg would go on to formulate the 12-tone system of composition, this is still many years before that, and he is starting to experiment with atonal writing and moving away from elements that remind us of functional harmony. This means that a lot of works feature exploration of melodic motives, which often are continually developing in a through-composed fashion, rarely appearing the same way twice. If you have enjoyed this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you have gained some insight.